Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing integrating artificial intelligence and public health with co-founder and chief financial officer of the public health company, Brian Levine. Learn how technical advances and software innovations are identifying exponential risk and revolutionizing the field of public health. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Brian Levine. He is a visionary combining two career passions and creating a better version of each. Brian started out spending 25 years at Goldman Sachs, where he changed the game by converting old school reliance on human traders to an automated risk process. More recently, his experience with the pandemic motivated Brian to co-found the Public Health Company, a corporation focused on converting public health expertise into software. As you will see in this interview, Brian's general life theme has always been to improve processes that he cares about but believes that are broken for some reason, and public health is definitely one of those processes that needs improvement. The pandemic taught us all how fragile our society is and how important a strong public health sector is, which is why combining artificial intelligence and public health is critical. By utilizing advanced technology to assess exponential risk and thus appropriately devote the effort necessary to contain these risks, that will revolutionize public health and lead to a safer planet for all of us. Listen up as we discuss integrating artificial intelligence with public health. Check it out. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
I'm good. Good. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Listen, man, I'm very excited to talk to you about your career, analytics, public health, sports, all the above. It's been quite a journey that you've had, and your experiences are fascinating. So I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, and I'm a fan of your podcast. I've listened to a few and very interesting, and I got a bunch more downloaded for my next few weeks of travel. So looking forward to that.
Thanks for saying that. Getting right to the beginning. Tell us how you started the Public Health Company and what was your impetus for starting that corporation?
Sure. So I guess it should probably worth taking it back because, from a background perspective, I'd spent 25 years at Goldman Sachs and I had recently retired, and it was pretty much the only full-time job that I'd ever had. And I knew I didn't want to be in finance, but knew I wanted to do something that was meaningful, whatever that meant. I wasn't really sure. And, I'd given myself a year to basically not make any decisions because I think a lot of people that have spent an entire career in a certain field, you kind of gravitate back. You get a little bit bored with doing nothing. The concept sounds good about exploring and just kind of relaxing. But, as a type A personality, you tend to gravitate back. So I gave myself a 1-year lockup to not make any career decisions. And in the middle of that year is when COVID hit. And a few months after that, I was connected to Dr. Charity Dean, who was previously the head of public health for the state of California. And the connection actually came through the author Michael Lewis, who was starting to write the book, The Premonition, that she ended up becoming the protagonist on. I was a relatively minor character in a book about 10 years ago from Michael on the stock market called Flash Boys. And she had just left public health, and she was incredibly frustrated by the response. If you've read the book, she was one of the first people to really, to before it actually hit the shores, wanted us to prepare a lot more than we did, and for numerous reasons that Michael gets into the book. Her advice wasn't really listened to despite her authority. And, she was very frustrated. And so we were connected in August of 2020, over Zoom. She was in California at the time. I was in Florida. And, she described the problems to me. And I realized, what she was incredibly frustrated and said that, this has to get solved. And she wasn't even talking about COVID. She was talking about, the future, that, it's a real problem. And I realized that, very similar to what I did at Goldman, you could take a very inefficient manual process and help automate it, and come up with higher quality solutions and ones that could be deployed at scale. Right. So we started this company, and grew it to almost 50 employees. We've raised $50 million. And, Yeah, I mean, and the goal was to do something better, and it was something that we all felt, right. We were living this reality, and it was fascinating actually starting a company, during COVID, because I was working with charity over Zoom. I was probably talking to her 5 to 10 hours a day, and we actually never even met in person for until about 10 months after we started a company together, when we had our first company offsite out in California, which was pretty fascinating to meet someone that you had kind of grown so close to, and then done so much with. So it was
So let me ask you a
quite the
question.
experience.
So you bring up how the pandemic really brought a lot of the deficiencies of our public health system to light, and how charity really noticed that there were these deficiencies and wanted to fix them. What would you say are the biggest deficiencies that both she and you identified because of the pandemic?
Well, the things that she used to say was that the system was remarkably antiquated, right? And she would say all the time, public health departments would communicate, via fax machines. She would be like, fax machines. Like, imagine sharing critically, time critical information with
Crazy.
sensitive data from one department to another via faxes. And even though, like, that's a good soundbite, it goes far beyond that, right? Because you really, the real issues with that, you need to create data standards across public health departments and the broader health care system. It's incredibly fragmented, right? And a lot of it is driven by the capitalistic aspects of our healthcare system. But you really need some, in general, you just need like a national infectious disease surveillance system that has access to all the necessary information. And we learned that the hard way, and that has to get improved. And in general, you know, unlike a lot of businesses, and I would just make these parallels all the time to finance. Is in finance, we had manual traders making all these decisions, but you had thousands of traders making similar decisions off of similar variables, and you can actually automate a lot of that, right? If you take in all of this information. And there are a lot of early warning signals, from a public health perspective. Things like wastewater, right, where in regions you could detect, long before there is an outbreak in a city, you could see through aggregated wastewater analysis that's going to be a problem, and you respond then. I think that was the major lesson. Everything was so reactive because time was so slow, and it was hard for decisions to be made. They were all made too late, right? So all of those decisions were after the outbreak had happened, and we'd locked people down after already the disease was out there. Obviously, it was an incubation period of a few weeks as well. And then that kind of damaged trust, right, in the system. And so then you have these other issues of where politics got into it, right? And like that's like the worst thing we could possibly have is when you allow a government driven public health institution to be potentially influenced by politics, right? It's a dangerous place for the lives of potentially millions to be dependent on, right? Responses should be driven by data and science, right? And because we lost that trust, we allowed ourselves to get influenced by things that I think we just lost control of the process, so to speak.
This episode of the Brain Surgeon's Take is brought to you by Vitamin Water. Vitamin water is the ideal way to hydrate, replete your electrolytes, and maintain wellness. I drink vitamin water routinely during the day in order to keep up my energy and focus. Check out vitaminwater.com for more information and use the promo code BrainSurgeonsTake for 20% off your first order. Are we in a better place now than we were 4 years ago, in your opinion?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I'd probably defer to experts. I pretend, I slept at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I pretend to be an expert on the subject. But based on I've been surrounded by some of the best infectious disease experts in the last few years, and speaking for many of them, definitely not, right. And the scary thing is it's less about COVID itself. It's more the fact that the rate of infectious disease outbreaks has grown exponentially. There were back in 1980, there were about 500 a year, and that's gone up almost every year. And I think this year you'll probably have about 5,000 outbreaks, right? And the reasons are obvious, right? It's climate change, it's increased population density, it's deforestation, and all these factors that lead to these increased risks. And, over the last 10, 20 years, you've seen it, whether it's, H1N1 and SARS and MERS, Ebola, whatever it is. And, they'll have different, case fatality rates and R naughts and other variables that go into infectious diseases. And they'll all be different, but the rate is going higher. And as a data person, I am concerned about the next one, right? And so it was always less about, even with Charity, it was like, okay, COVID, we assumed at some point that was going to end. But her concern was there were just going to be more. And this was a great warning to the country that we need to improve this. And, to your question, like, it's kind of surprising to me that we haven't really focused as much on improving that process. And that's one of the things that the public health company is trying to do. Mostly, we're interacting with corporations who, they learned that they had to protect their people. I think corporations learned that they had a risk that they had not accounted for before, right? And we're talking about the safety of their people, millions of dollars of revenues lost because of a bad response. And they want to own those risks themselves, right? And so there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to have access to the data that they thought the government was going to be providing to them to help their people.
Now, you state that one of your passions in life and your career is to improve processes that don't run as efficiently as they possibly could. Why has this always driven you? And give us 3 examples of processes that you identified that are good but could be great or could be the best, and what you did.
Sure. So, to answer your question as to why I have an obsession to improve processes, it's probably because I'm 3/4 German. It's probably the actual answer to that. But I would say, like, it's just something that I've always obsessed about. Like, it's just something. I've always, even during my career at Goldman, one of my credos was be an owner, not a user. I used to say that to people all the time because, I feel like people very often tend to become, passengers in life. Like, they don't think that they can affect change, that they can do things. And there's so much more that people can do, no matter, how successful they're being. You're one of the greatest neurosurgeons and you've created this podcast, right? Like, that's not a normal thing either. That's something where, you've decided to do that. And, there's so many more things that I think individuals are capable of. And, people tend to psychologically put themselves in a box. They think this is my job description. This is what I do. And I've never wanted to do that. To give you, one example, when I started at Goldman Sachs, I started as a stock trader in 1994, straight out of school. And the process of stock trading back then was wildly manual, very manual, screaming. You've seen the videos. You don't see very much of that anymore. And it seemed really fairly nonsensical to me at the time because, I remember sitting on a stool as an intern, just on the trading desk. And, the big situation would be, there's a big block of stock to trade and the salesperson would scream, I've got 1 million Microsoft for sale. What's the price? Right. And the trader would stand up and it'd be a lot of drama. It gets quiet and spends a few seconds. He's looking at a screen, shouts out a price. They say sold, screaming. And, we would make or lose $1 million based on that decision. And I would ask the trader, how did you come up with that decision? And he'd be like, I don't know, kid. I'm looking at the stock. It's moving up and down. And where were the buyers and sellers and, all these different things. And back then it was kind of early days of Excel and I was using Microsoft Excel and I'm like, okay, well, this isn't that complicated. There's a few key variables. And so I spent a month or two kind of putting together what was really like a block trading pricer tool in Excel, looking at some basic variables, without getting into the details, like average daily volume in a stock and some volatility measures that were publicly known, like short-term vol and long-term vol. And I presented to the traders after like a month, this block pricing tool. And I thought that this was the most, revolutionary thing in the world. And I literally was laughed out of the room. There was a trader would say like, kid, you're a couple months out of school and you're basically saying that, you took this spreadsheet thing and all of my special sauce you just put into that. Like, that's like, who do you think you are? And I was like, oh, I guess I overestimated, what you could do. And I remember the next morning, the funniest part was, we used to, on the trading desk, we would order lunch. We'd have menus. We had waiters that would actually serve us lunch because it was so crazy that we couldn't take a lunch break. Like, you'd run to the bathroom during the trading day from 9:30 to 4. No one could leave because, we were so important. And I remember one of the traders was ordering lunch that morning, and he goes, "Hey Eddie, what are you ordering for lunch today?" And Eddie goes, "I don't know, Levine, what's your spreadsheet say I should eat today?" And the whole trading floor is hysterical, and I'm sitting there thinking like, "Oh my God, I'm getting fired! Like, what an idiot!" And it took a bunch of years, but eventually, like, it's very hard. And I think it's true in any industry, right? Like change, people who are doing something, they gravitate to what they know best, and change is often threatening and they don't understand it. And so there's a natural resistance to it. So, over time, I then, helped create algorithms for trading and central order risk books that actually manage billions of dollars of a portfolio in a manual sense. And, we went from, probably 600 equity traders at Goldman Sachs in 2000 to literally just a handful today. I mean, most of it's automated, and now it's really just like the higher touch functions, like those million share blocks of stock that you really need individuals to manage, and it's a lot more efficient process. So that's definitely one. Another one I'd say too is I'm a huge sports fan, and I've spent and given analytics, I've focused a lot on sports analytics as well, and I'm very involved with my alma mater, University of Florida. I met my wife there. My daughter's a student there, and I've served on a couple of boards. And a couple of months ago, I've spent a lot of time with the new basketball coach, who's very, pro analytics. And, we were talking about the fact that analytics is kind of nowhere from a college sports perspective. In fact, as I did research, there really isn't a sports program that works directly that with their students, or with a program that does analytics to actually help the team. And this is something that on the pro side, as you know, has grown exponentially. And there are hundreds of students on every campus that want these types of jobs. And you would think that, that they would have created something. But it doesn't exist. I mean, there are some schools that, at MIT and Wharton, that have like a curriculum in sports analytics. They do conferences, but they don't really work directly with the sports program. So a couple of months ago, I helped create a sports analytics department, University of Florida. It's a JV with the AI department. And I just think the opportunity is immense there, because you've seen what's happened in pro sports and with college sports, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry as well. There's a tremendous amount that you can do, whether it has to do with player evaluation or scouting or biometrics, improving, the ability of players, which is then a recruiting tool for schools too. That's what the top athletes in the world want to go to a school to become a pro athlete. And if you could help them do that, injury prevention, I listened to your podcast, Dr. Lee Kaplan, and he was talking about that as well. Like that's then the best thing. Like there's a lot to be done there to help athletes, not get injured and to become better, better athletically. And it's a fascinating sort of arbitrage to me that it doesn't exist in college, where, you've seen Moneyball happen in all the pro sports, some more than others. Baseball, I think, is a sport that's, has a greater proclivity to analytics because it's much more bilateral. It's pitcher batter, and you can kind of control the data. Whereas, something like football, it's 11 on 11, and it's hard to isolate things as much. But in college sports, it doesn't exist, and I find it fascinating because I do think it has a lot to do with the coaching. Coaches have such control in college, and I think they're very short term oriented. Like, to be focused on analytics, you've got to be really long term focused, and I think most coaches, they're much more concerned about how many wins I get next season. Right? You just got to survive, and they have tremendous power in the universities, and they're also, they tend to be more old school, right? Because they haven't been around it. They're probably more resistant to analytics than the younger coaches are. And so it doesn't really, it doesn't, I'm sure that from faculties in AI, want to get involved, and the coaches are like, it's unnecessary. And there's actually a great stat. I don't know if you're familiar, that if you look at the highest paid public employees in all 50 states, the vast majority are college football coaches. And the ones that aren't college football coaches are men's college basketball coaches, all 50 states. highest paid public employees. So they've got a lot of influence, and they haven't really taken up, I think, analytics by and large. And I just think it's a huge opportunity, because with anything with analytics from a competitive standpoint, if you're doing it, nobody else is. That opportunity gap tends to be wider, and I think everyone will get there. But hopefully, it's something that'll be a competitive advantage for a while for UF.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of points on what you just said. Number one, people pushing outside their comfort zone, pushing outside kind of what they're expected to do, and always don't take the status quo as good enough, but always realize that anything can be better. Nothing's ever good enough. And I think that's something that you've really embodied, which is great. And then going into the analytics, big data is everything, right? Big data is everything in sports, whether it's also in finances, medicine. It's all about big data driven. And you mentioned college sports. I think that's a great example of where it can be. Let's talk about other potential avenues that you've been involved with sports analytics, because sports is such a major enterprise and analytics is getting more and more important. So for example, we had discussed previously tanking games to get a higher draft pick, right? Discuss the analytics behind that paradigm.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that fascinates me really with American sports is that, American sports is one of the few, we're in the bastion of capitalism. And yet in our major American sports leagues, we've had this system for years where we reward failure by the worst performing teams get the top draft picks, which, maybe made sense 50 years ago before there were multi-billion dollar businesses. Parity is obviously an important variable for fans. But one of the things that's also changed over the last, decade or two is that most of these leagues, they also have instituted some form of salary caps. And the salary caps is a much better governor for parity, right? Because, as opposed to look at European football where there are teams competing in the same league where salaries are many multiples higher, like, 10x. That's rare. In baseball, there's a little bit of it still, but there's a luxury tax involved. So, given you've got that governor of salary cap, when you have a system where all you're doing is rewarding the champion, right? In European football, there's promotion relegation, right? So even late into the season, most of the teams are still trying to win, right? Because it's not, even if you're not playing for the championship, you really don't want to get relegated down because that's bad for the players. It's certainly bad for the owners, right? Because from media contracts and whatnot, it's incredibly, penal. In American sports, everyone's kind of playing for a championship. So as you get to the trade deadlines, which, for the NHL, NBA, we just passed, you now have these barbells where every team says, I'm either going for the championship or I'm not. Like, I don't care. I don't want to finish 500. There's no benefit, right? So I'm going to give away, if I'm not going for the championship, I may as well give away all of my players and get prospects and get draft picks. And what they're doing now, they're even, selling, they're basically, selling their salary cap space, right? There are teams that are saying, okay, like, I'm not going to win this year anyway. If you want to give me a player that's, that's useless, that isn't contributing, but costs you $7 million a year, give me a few draft picks and I'll put him on my roster. And, so you're really getting this real barbell and you're getting these unintended effects. And, that's what we call tanking. And I think it's an unintended effect that I don't think anyone who's running these sports leagues really want. But, there are ways to control it. The most fascinating one, I don't know if you've seen the PWHL, which is the women's hockey league that's exploded this year. They just created this thing called the Gold Plan, which it's fascinating to me that in hockey, there's really two things. One is from a playoff perspective, the number one seed will choose their opponent in the playoffs, which I love. I love that from a drama perspective, but it also, I think particularly in hockey, there isn't much of a benefit. Once you make the playoffs, you're one of those 16 teams. Doesn't matter so much if you're the 1, 2, or 3 seeds. Home ice advantage literally means 1 or 2% difference analytically on a series. But more importantly, because of the trade deadline, you could have the best record in the NHL, and your first round matchup, just because they're the bottom in your division, could have loaded up on the trade deadline and be one of the scariest teams in the league. And that happened to the Tampa Bay Lightning a few years ago. They had the best record in the NHL by 20 points, and they got stuck facing, the Columbus Blue Jackets, who loaded up in the trade deadline, and they got swept by Columbus in the first round. So in this Gold Plan, the team that finishes first chooses their opponent, which you could see like that could be a tremendous amount of fun. You could, fans could have a say, and like there's just a tremendous amount of drama around that, and I think it adds a little more incentive to finish well in the regular season. But the bigger thing about the Gold Plan is on draft order, and what they do. It's not just the last place team picks first, which is how it is, and there's some lottery components that exist in sports that mitigate that to some degree. But what they do is that you still have to try to win. Once you are eliminated from the playoffs, you accumulate points, and you're the most points. So once you get eliminated from the playoffs, the better you do, you're playing for the top draft pick, right? So you're naturally going to have the worst teams are going to get eliminated first. So they're going to have the best chance to get, but then they have to win, right? So if you're eliminated with 30 games left, right, you're the first team that's mathematically eliminated. You're going to have the best chance of getting those points that earned you the first pick. But you're not going to tank. You're not going to sell all your players because now you have to really win
I
to
like
at
that.
least have a top. Yeah, and the goal obviously this is all about incentives, right? Like you want teams to continue to try, and even though teams will say they're trying, we all know they're not, right? And at least once they're out of it, they are behaving like teams that aren't trying, and that's just bad for competitiveness, and it's really bad too in the last week of the season if your team is fighting for a playoff spot and your competitor is playing a last place team that's playing a bunch of minor league players like that, it spoils it for everybody. So I think the tanking concept is something I feel like needs to be addressed a lot more by the major pro sports leagues.
The other thing that you talked about analytics being heavily involved, or at least should be, fourth down decision making in football. Talk a little bit about the analytics of that.
Sure. So, I think for football, that's the one that's the process that's gotten the most focus over the last decade or so. The analytics community had always said that teams kick way too much, mostly punting, but even field goals. They should be going for it much more. And the reason is it's like the human element, I think, that if you're a coach, and again, as I said before, coaches are very short term oriented. They don't tend to last all that long. It's about, maximizing your career. If they go for it on 4th and 2 and fail, we all know, and they lose that game, all the media and the fans are talking about is, they should have taken the points or they should have kicked because it's a traditional thing to do. And so as a result, they were kicking far more than even they knew that they should have. And this gets to like the key for analytics to really work is that you need buy-in from the very top. And this was true even at Goldman Sachs. I mean, there were processes, I was running a quant business where we would take a lot of risk and, the odds, that might be 55%, 45%. But as you and I know, you're going to lose a lot of money a lot of times. But in the long run, that's going to work out. So you need to have buy-in from the top that they believe in that, right? So that you're not just, there are going to be times where, you roll snake eyes a couple of times in a row and you get fired, right? And coaches don't want that. So as a result, you need to have that buy-in. And so a great example was, I had a conversation with a man named Andrew Berry, who actually was an intern of mine at Goldman Sachs back in 2008, 2009. And he actually became the youngest general manager in NFL history. He's actually the GM of the Cleveland Browns. But he was working for the Eagles back in 2017 when they won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles. And we were having a conversation about analytics, and their analytics team going to that season had determined that still teams were not going for fourth down nearly enough. And so from the owner on down, they basically were, they agreed like we need to go for it more often, and this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to be swayed by the fact that it isn't going to work sometimes. In fact, I believe the owner even said to the team, don't, I've got your back. Like if you fail 3, 4, 5 times in a row and the media is coming after you, I've got your back. Don't worry about that. And sure enough, that season, the Philadelphia Eagles had the most fourth down attempts in NFL history. They did win the Super Bowl. Obviously, there are a lot of the variables that go into that. But it was an important lesson that, that's, and you see it now, it's far more common. And, to get into the reasons why, I think what people tend to miss, in the most basic one, if it's say 4th and goal from the 2 or 3 yard line, right? You could easily do the math and say, well, there's, a 40% chance they score a touchdown. You kick the field goal, it's 3 points versus 7 points. It's about the same. The thing they generally miss is the expected value of the field position, where you are on the field. So if you kick the field goal from the 3, you have to kick the ball off, and average starting field position maybe 30 yard line, let's say 25 yard line. But if you go on 4th down, you score the touchdown, that's great. If you don't, the other team starts on the 1, 2, or 3 yard line, and typically they will go 3 and out at least half the time. And so the average, you actually gain about 2 points in expected value based on where the other team starts with the ball. And that wasn't something I think that had been thought through. Then analytics made it very clear to people that there are multiple points a game that teams are sacrificing by kicking in some of those situations.
It's super interesting. And again, like you said, it's everyone has an opinion, but the only true data is just big numbers, big analytics, and I think getting into that is critical. Now you've done analytics, obviously financially in terms of Goldman Sachs. You brought that to the public health company. You brought it into sports. Such a diverse career. What's your next big challenge, Brian?
It's actually been pickleball. As funny as that is to say, I think a lot of people have gotten obsessed with it. It's the fastest growing sport in America, and like many people, I've become obsessed. Both as a player and as a fan. And the pro game is very nascent. And I think that there have been several companies competing with each other. Which is pretty inefficient because there isn't much of a market yet. For pro fans. So these companies really need to focus their resource on promoting the game, promoting the players rather than just trying to kill each other. So I've spent much of the last 2 years trying to get the two top leagues and tours to merge. And that deal actually finally closed a few weeks ago. And hopefully now we can focus on growing this game. And, I find that, I love the game, and I think it's something, it's actually, I find it fascinating to watch. And I think it's going to be a mainstream spectator sport. It's just going to take some time. I often will use the golf analog that, having a participation sport, actually the best one is if you look at the 20 largest countries in the world, the sport that is most popular to be played is also the top sport as a spectator sport in 15 of them, right? And in the other five, it's number two, which makes sense, right? If you're in England, you play soccer, you watch soccer. It's if you're in India, cricket, you play and you watch it, and in all these different countries. But these sports have been popular for generations, and so pickleball is fast on its way coming to the top participation sport in the country, and there's a massive build out in courts that'll most likely get us there. And to me, it would be anomalous if it wasn't a popular sport. And from a golf perspective, I find it amazing, and I play golf, that it's such a popular spectator sport. But if you think about the people that sit home on a Sunday and watch PGA or Live, they every one of them is an addicted golfer themselves. In fact, the concept that you'd have someone who's a spectator, someone who watches the pro game who doesn't play at all, seems crazy because it isn't the fastest game in the world. And the reason that they watch is because they love the game, they're obsessed, and they want to see the best players in the world perfect their craft, right? They want to see, Rory McIlroy hit a 7-iron, 230 yards with a draw that cuts back to the hole, and and that all makes sense. As a pickleball player who's addicted, and there are now 10 million plus Americans who are addicted pickleball players, I want to see the best in the world too, and how they construct a point. And so from a business perspective, we have to create that, that interest, and that's going to take some time. But the business had been pretty fragmented, and I think that that's true in all major sports leagues, right? I think most sports leagues, it's not coincidental that they really took off once the pro leagues merged. Whether you're talking about the NBA, ABA, and the NHL, WHL, and NFL, AFL, and even Major League Baseball, over 100 years ago, right? So I think we're getting to that point where we can really, grow that game, and that's what I define as my next challenge.
Unbelievable. Listen, Brian, thank you so much for your time. I think the real take home points for our listeners: number one, don't ever tell or don't ever accept what people tell you that you're supposed to do and need to do and should do. If you think that there's a way to do something better, go for it. You've been an example of that all your career at Goldman Sachs and the public health company, into sports analytics, now into pickleball. Bottom line is never accept the status quo, always push the boundaries and make processes better. And you've done that. And number two is just the importance of big data. We talked about it in the public health sector, first and foremost, but then you branched off into your other passions, especially in sports. And I think the more that we understand AI, analytics, big data, I think a lot of these processes are going to improve, and it's up to us to implement them.
Yep, absolutely. And not to be afraid of change. I think it's something that, it's something that's wired in our brains to go for comfort, and failure, rejection, whatever those are negative aspects of trying new avenues. is not so bad, right? I think that's the important lesson that I think most people should really adhere to. So thank you for doing this podcast. It's great.
Awesome, Brian. And we'll talk soon. I really appreciate your time today.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Commodore.